everyone, and welcome back to this, I was about to say the final session of the third day of the inquiry, and in some ways the final session of our inquiry, but you realise, of course, the more you look into this, the more you want to understand, and that there is a good deal more to do. You can't hear me? Hang on. Can you hear me? Andrew can. Patricia can. Everyone can. Okay, great. So one person just messaged me, say they can't. So I'm going to keep going. All right. Well, listen. I was just saying. Here I am. It's the last session, but the reason I'm saying it's not is that it's important to know what we were trying to do in setting this up has been to try and essentially chart the gap between the official reality and the real reality. And that has meant, where possible, calling out the things that have just been excessive PR, and in other cases, trying to identify pieces of real mismanagement. But in this final session today, we're moving away from government and we're moving to the healthcare industry, because in the way in which we have, in the course of this, moved from groups of people in the way in which they're affected, parts of government, the way in which they've operated. We've also looked at industries and organizations that have played a critical role, and none has arguably played a more critical one than the healthcare industry. And what we're trying to do is try and understand how effectively it's responded. We're at a critical moment, obviously, in understanding vaccines, but we want to go back and think a little bit about ventilators, test and trace, PPE, and then obviously into the vaccines and therapies that we're front of mind at the moment. Once again, we're very lucky that we've got Jeremy Breyer here, who again is not going to, if you like, either prosecute or defend a case, but if you might, Jeremy, do a little of both, set out the skeleton argument so that we can then frame our thinking about the healthcare industry. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, James. I'm going to assume you can all hear me unless I hear otherwise.
We can hear you. You're not just sort of in a cupboard talking to yourself, even though there have been large parts of 2020 that might have felt like that.
Well, very much so. But actually, I do echo what you say. This inquiry has been so fascinating. I've followed a great deal of it, and it's a real honour to be part of it. In the week when the first vaccines were approved for public use, it may seem odd, even bad taste, to ask the question, did the healthcare industry move quickly enough? But the healthcare industry is expansive, and there have been major ups and major downs that I hope this session will explore. When it came to producing a vaccine, there is no doubt that the research and development spurred on by orders in their hundreds of millions has been immense. It was about this time last year, on December the 1st, that COVID-19 was first documented. On January the 10th of this year, the SARS-CoV-2 virus was first sequenced by scientists. And I think it took just 5 days for Moderna and NIH to design the mRNA vaccine following this. Their phase 1/2 trial began in March, with Pfizer's following suit in early May. The interim results and efficacy of those vaccines, as we all know, started to become clear this autumn, with Moderna and Pfizer both celebrating 95% efficacy in mid-November, with Oxford and AstraZeneca heralding yet a further breakthrough on the 23rd. So on one level, we have undoubtedly witnessed, we are continuing to witness, the most extraordinary, accelerated immunological progress that we could ever have imagined. Who could have ever predicted this time last year that the public at large would be discussing and praising pharmaceutical companies? The difficulties of administering and storing vaccines at low temperatures would be common pub debates, if we were allowed to go into pubs. And multinational efforts required to share this success story with the developing world would be a key challenge. But against this backdrop, there's a very different healthcare and medical story. Lockdown was first introduced to protect our NHS, a health service that we had formerly understood was there to protect us, was suddenly a health service that we were required to protect. It was ill-equipped and frankly ill-prepared to deal with a pandemic. The most obvious concerns were PPE and capacity, beds, and in particular, ventilation and ICU beds. And so I ask, where were the long-term thinkers? Where were the contingency planners? Who foresaw this coming, and have any lessons been learned? We didn't know what 2020 would bring, but a question I want to ask and explore is, what about 2021 or 2022? Is there a team right here, right now, planning for the next healthcare crisis? We were certainly quick at building the Nightingale hospitals, those great arenas like the ExCeL Centre in London, transformed in 9 days into a huge temporary field hospital. Critical care beds were at the core of what we needed. Dr. Charlotte Summers, writing in The Guardian, said that in February 2020, there were about 4,000 open adult critical care beds in England, 81% of which were occupied. At the peak of the first wave in April 2020, there were 3,100 patients with COVID-19 in English critical care units. Approximately 58% of all available critical care beds in England, including the surge capacity generated at places like the Nightingale hospitals, were occupied by patients with COVID. So on the face of it, we weren't overwhelmed. But was the cost turning away other patients with other illnesses needing other operations? What are the long-term medical and healthcare ramifications of this sacrifice, or perhaps this cost-benefit analysis? And any relative success in capacity was surely because of the effective lockdown. If it wasn't for the enormous restrictions on our lives and the economic catastrophes inflicted on our populations, we would have been overwhelmed, wouldn't we? Because critical care beds are nothing without the properly trained intensive care staff that know how to work in intensive care. Mass casualty events like coronavirus showed up the conundrum. It's possible to rapidly increase resources, to ship in PPE left, right, and centre, perhaps from anyone you can get your hands on it from. And you can build a hospital like Challenge Annika, but you can't suddenly train nurses overnight or redeploy orthopaedic surgeons as ICU specialists. Mm-hmm. So, although we clapped outside for the NHS in springtime and we can pat ourselves on the back in autumn, the NHS was protected, it did cope. We might ask the better question, the more important question: at what price and what now? It's telling that we cannot cope with a mass casualty event without a blanket shutdown. And this blanket point is important, as we discussed in the session before lunch about how women were disproportionately affected. Because although this virus disproportionately affects the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions, the fears of the healthcare services being crippled meant that working age men and women, children and teenagers were all subjected to the same lockdown treatment. So I see 2020 as a story of huge medical triumphs, but also challenges and the exposure of systemic failings that we need to discuss. What will 2021 bring? Well, vaccines will be at the heart of the story. A vaccine take-up which works could bring an end to this crisis. Will it be business as usual after that? The debate in today's news is all about who gets it and when. The provisional plan would see 88.5 million vaccination doses across England, with 2 doses for every person over the age of 18 by the end of April. And we've seen the priority list and the phases: healthcare workers, care home residents and staff, this month. On LBC this morning, Nick Ferrari was asking the question, who gets the vaccine first, the surgeons or the grannies? Is this a real dilemma? Because the answer's both. But in what order? Who decides? Does that precise calibration matter? Are we logically equipped for the delivery process? Or are we just going to see more scandals down the line about how they aren't getting through? And what should we do about the vaccine refuseniks? How much of a spanner in the works could they be if, say, a sizable minority of the population refuse to get vaccinated? One answer might be to force their hand, linking vaccinations to freedoms. If we don't do that, don't we risk squandering the advances that our experts have made? And having trampled on our freedoms to live and work all year, why now should we expect freedom of choice to be successfully invoked when it comes to refusing a vaccine? Either way, the hopes and futures of our nation undoubtedly remain delicately balanced in the hands of our healthcare professionals. 2020 may have been the most challenging year in living memory for the healthcare industry, but I couldn't with any confidence say that 2021 won't be just as demanding. Over to you.
Jeremy, thank you. That is a very good way of tipping into this last session with an eye into 2021. I'm going to try to, in the course of this conversation, as ever, try and bring in people who've got points or personal experiences they think are useful to give in evidence. But unlike a normal thinking, we're really trying to hear directly from those people who've been in different ways close to or studying the performance of the healthcare industry in this year. And I'm really grateful that Fiona Godley is here. Fiona is the editor of the BMJ, the British Medical Journal. I'm the son of a doctor, Fiona. So for years, I remember growing up and having that duck egg blue magazine cover come into the house. And I wanted to start, if I might, Fiona, with something that might feel like a sort of emotional jumping off point rather than an analytical one, which is, what's your read on what the medical profession, what doctors and nurses and people working in hospitals and surgeries have thought of the provision of treatments, therapies, and equipment from the healthcare industry in 2020? The reason I ask it is I know a little bit about what I think they think of their political masters of even NHS management, but I really don't know what they think of the healthcare industry.
Thanks very much, James, and hello, everyone. I think that's a very interesting question because I'm not sure it's very easy to separate out the healthcare industry from the political masters and the managers. I mean, there, so many of the things in ways in which the healthcare industry has responded or failed to respond, be prepared or failed to be prepared, has been a result of political decisions and resourcing decisions and budgetary decisions over the past 10 years. But just focusing on your question in terms of what my sense is of how the healthcare professions feel, I think at the start of the pandemic, there were two kind of counteracting feelings that I was aware of and others talked about. One was clearly, just getting on with the job, a really heightened sense of purpose, a real sense that this is what we're here to do, renewed teamwork that had been lost, people, repurposing, cardiac surgeons working on intensive care, that sort of real sense of energy and purpose, which I think was fantastic to see. But alongside that, a sense of perhaps almost betrayal and really neglect in terms of their own safety. And I have 3 nieces who are junior doctors, as well as family members who are general practitioners, all of whom felt, and one heard this from our many readers, really, really distressed and frightened for themselves, their families, their colleagues, and having to confront for the first time, many of them, large numbers of very severely ill people and people dying. So I think there were those two things going alongside each other. And I think that point about the protecting the NHS is such an interesting one, isn't it? Because the words can hit wrong. They can give the wrong impression, as if the NHS is more precious than the people it serves. But I think, it may have been the wrong words, but it was really just to say the fear that the NHS would experience people out on the streets, dying in the pavements, lying in corridors untreated. And that was a true, real fear for people. So it was a mixed picture at the beginning. And I think now where we are is a certain weariness, but also people very proud of how the NHS has responded. I think a very mixed picture probably in terms of how much they trust the government, the managers, the industry to deliver. So, we move into it 2021 rather, I think, a bit weary, a bit maybe sometimes a bit cynical, but still entirely committed to delivering the care.
Can I ask you, can we do a few sort of different things? And I would like to do them in turn, if I might. Fiona, ventilators. What's your lesson of what happened in terms of the rush for ventilators and the change in the use of ventilators in treatment of COVID?
Well, I should say I'm not an expert in intensive care by any means, but my understanding of what happened was there was an assumption that ventilators would be the thing that we would need, and we didn't have enough of them. And there was a rush, rather weirdly, instead of just manufacturing the American model that everyone was used to, this kind of let's do something British and unusual and get some whole new ventilators designed and created, which I think, misfired quite badly. And in the end, as I understand it, we did rely on models that we were used to. But underlying that was a recognition that came from China, but also from Italy, and perhaps was a bit slow to get through, that ventilation may not be the thing that patients needed, that this wasn't the same as a flu-like illness, which caused you difficulties in actually breathing, but it was actually to do with oxygenation. And so that the better process in many patients was to have CPAP, which is this positive pressure airways treatment, which is much less intensive, and it's easier to kind of titrate. You can take it on and off a bit, and it's much less uncomfortable, although it is uncomfortable. And so there was a kind of almost a clinical recognition that the rush for ventilators had probably been slightly misguided. I mean, not quite understandably, and in some cases perhaps ventilation was overused, and patients may have been suffered as a result and maybe have died as a result. So it was a kind of mixed picture of provision and clinical recognition of the need.
And can I just ask you one thing about that, which is, at the beginning of the day, Fiona, Gus O'Donnell was talking about the government's apparent inability to learn from other governments. And Matt D'Ancona was asking him a little bit about how would London look to Singapore, etc. One of the questions that I think has begun to creep up on us within the UK is the ability of different NHS hospitals to learn from each other. And for example, just on ventilators in particular, it feels as though there's a very different record in different hospitals on the use of them, and as you say, the effectiveness of them. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think we have to recognise that there will be inevitably people who are lots of expertise focused into centres of excellence in the country, and that in other places being confronted with equally ill people and maybe not being able to transfer them to centres of excellence. There'll be people who are practicing beyond their immediate kind of comfort zone and competence, and I think that's, and also you've mentioned the problem of lack of nursing staff and that kind of resource. But I would like to just herald something which I think many people were very struck by, which was a slightly different way in which people can communicate, as opposed to the usual slightly traditional ways through journals or through NHS management or through conferences at the end of each year, the respiratory people all getting together. There was a sort of extended email chain sent out from the Royal Free Hospital from a consultant there, which was just, they got together on a Zoom call. I think lots of people had a conversation, and this one intensivist shared the sort of summary of what was said. This was back in, I'm going to say March, April time. And it was a very striking example of how under pressure at the, when the need is there, the professional, the experts getting together just based on their expertise and their experience rather than any published evidence, and just started saying, this is what we're seeing. Is anyone else seeing this? This is what we're doing. This is how we're managing it. And that whole peer working together was very impressive to see, and I think it's something that we could do much more of in future. It's where you're working beyond the evidence.
Just I'm sorry, because I have to confess I missed that entirely. So it was a Royal Free ICU consultant, doctor, who started the email chain, and what then it really moved around.
Well, and my memory of it was that everyone was dealing with this new thing and didn't really know what to do, even though China had done a lot and Italy had had its big problems, and there had been exchanges. That was the other thing that I think was remarkable, was that a lot of the expert clinicians have got research and academic networks where they're already working with people in other countries, and so sort of in perhaps below the radar, there were conversations going on, and my memory of what happened, it'd be worth sort of just checking up on this as an episode, was that yes, this group of intensivists got together by Zoom and had the conversation, and then this consultant at the Royal Free shared that information in a very comprehensive email, which was very much saying, we don't quite know, but this is what we're seeing, this is what we're doing. Try this may work. And it was a very honest and productive kind of recognition of humility, saying, you know, we're all trying to work together on this in the face of huge uncertainty.
Just as you were speaking, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, and then on to Dr. Sumit Sidhu in a second. But Dr. J.D. Williamson was on and has been messaging as you were speaking. And Dr. Williamson, are you there?
Yeah, I am.
So do you know a little about what Fiona was just talking about?
Yeah, so I can expand upon a couple of bits. So I'm an anaesthetist in North London, and it was the professors based at my hospital and some of the other hospitals that came up with this email chain from UCL, Whittington, Royal Free, and they contacted their professor links in Italy in particular, and circulated their experiences to all of the staff as well, and then clearly onwards to other people. Which was great in the context of not having any other sources of information really to go by, or central guidance on what we should be doing. So that was really invaluable. A couple of quick points if I can make about the ventilators, if we've got time, James?
Yeah, yes.
So day to day, just for a bit of context, anaesthetists are sort of experts in ventilators, along with the ICU doctors. And maybe this is slightly hindsight bias looking back on what we've done, but I think lots of things were overlooked about it, and it became a talisman for the government, like other things like how many people they've tested a day, was how many ventilators they were getting, without thinking about the consequences of it. Now, I'm familiar using ventilators, but if you present me with a ventilator I've never come across, it's going to take me a bit of time to learn how to use it, and I'm meant to be an expert in that. We use some of our theatre ventilators, for example, in intensive care, and that presented a real problem because people didn't know how to use them. So different members of staff were coming out to use them. So, I mean, staff knowledge of particular ventilators is huge. Hospital capacity to use ventilators as well. Our hospitals aren't designed for the flows of oxygen that we needed to treat all the COVID patients. So our oxygen supply alarms were going off almost constantly because of the amounts of oxygen we needed to deliver to the ventilated devices, which were incredibly intensive. It's about 60 litres a minute. We couldn't have had any more ventilators regardless. If you give them to us, we couldn't have used them because our hospital wasn't set up for that purpose. Again, you didn't have places to put the ventilators to put the patients on. All these other things were overlooked. So I don't think having lots of ventilators was the thing. We didn't have ICU nurses. That was the biggest thing. We'd have a ratio of 6 patients to 1 ICU nurse instead of 1 to 1. We needed them, not ventilators. And the headlines are all about how well we were doing manufacturing things with Dyson, but I think that's besides the point.
Well, that's really interesting, Dr. Williamson. Thank you very much. Fiona, before I turn to Sumit Sidhu, which I'd like to in a moment, I want to just ask about one of the next phases in the thinking about provision by the healthcare industry, which was about the requisite components for test and trace. And there's been a lot of political noise around test and trace, but some of the difficulties here were just getting the right, active chemicals for the, Roche tests, the operation of these labs. And I wondered whether or not, just in the way in which, J.D. Williamson was just making the point about, we fetishized or we focused on Dyson and machinery, but we didn't have enough thinking about the people, whether or not on test and trace, there have been issues about the industrial and the supply chain end of this that we probably underestimate. And I wonder whether or not you have any views on that.
Well, the test and trace in the UK is going to be the subject of PhD theses for years to come. And I have to say, it has been very, very distressing to see, a real shambles. I don't know how else to put it. And there are so many elements that have failed to be implemented. In the independent stage, I think rightly stressed that they're find, test, trace, isolate and support. There are 5 elements to this. The focus of government action has been attention early on was about the test bit of it. We haven't got the tests. How many tests have we got? Let's get the target of how many hundreds of thousands a day. And obviously that was important. You had to have the tests in order to do all those other things. But in the absence of those other things, the testing itself becomes rather meaningless. If you have a positive test and you can't afford to isolate and you haven't got the support, then that's absolutely pointless. And if you don't then have a system for contact tracing, then you're not going to get the suppression of the virus that the whole test, trace, isolate thing was supposed to provide. The other issue is you will all have heard Paul Nurse talking about his frustration at the Crick Institute, seeing how things were going or not going, and how people in the NHS were saying, we're here, we've got labs, we've got the required stuff, we could do this. People at local public health saying we could do the contact tracing. The government not going down that route. The government ideologically, I think, just completely, they don't have a muscle that tends them into the public sector. They have their muscles all send them into the commercial sector and centralized control. So they didn't sort of their whole response was misdirected, I think. And they've been very slow then to sort of redirect themselves, despite vast amounts of people saying this is really catastrophic, and arguably the second lockdown could have been avoided. Arguably we wouldn't need to rush for the vaccine, because we could have a proper test and trace system which would work. These are such basic public health things. The public health system has been sort of decimated a bit over the past 10-15 years, but it could have responded much. It was ready, people were there. I do believe that if the government had been the type of people who would trust local response, we could have done so much better. So the test piece is obviously a hugely important piece. I don't want to undermine that, but it only makes sense in the context of all those other things.
Fiona, thank you. I'm going to come back to you in a moment. Jane Mays has made a comment in the chat about home visits, care home visits. I want to come back to that in a moment, because there's been so much focus on surgeries and quite a bit on care homes, and not as much on doctors' surgeries by comparison with hospitals. So I'm going to come back to you if I might, but I'd like to bring in Dr. Sumit Sidhu. Sumit, are you there?
I'm here, yeah, and I can hear you.
Hello there. Would you help us just as a start, just by sort of standing back, if you like, and giving you your judgment? No, not standing back physically, although that frames you very nicely, but standing back in terms of giving a sense of what you think has been the performance of the healthcare industry. We're at a moment now where there's a whiff of, if you like, excitement about the possibility of vaccines, but we might lose sight of what the attitude's been through the course of the year. So will you start by giving us that sort of broader judgment first?
Yeah, sure. And just so you sort of get a sense of where I'm speaking from. So I'm a medical doctor by training and worked as a junior doctor, and then sort of left into a different field, which is in drug development. So I'm, took a bit of a creative route out into now where I am, which is as a biotech CEO and founder. And, we sort of earlier this year, January, February, happened to be developing a drug, which is an anti-inflammatory drug. And we were developing in rheumatoid arthritis, completely unrelated. But in a sort of quite strange, actually, turn of events, it happens to be that the immune system is both the champion of the cure in the sort of vaccine scenario in COVID, but is also the cause of deaths in COVID. So what I really liked about Jeremy's framing there was actually, for me, it sort of had a very direct correlation to the science that sits behind all of this. I think sometimes that science, and this has happened, in my experience from the start of the year, has sort of been left behind. And perhaps has been overshadowed by other factors, and that's because this is more complex than just the science itself. But from the way I was looking at it, and I'm from a medical family as you are, James. My dad's a GP. My mum actually works in a nursing home, so I saw very different facets. But in the biotech space, what we saw early on in the start of this pandemic is that biotechs were basically small, nimble, quick-moving decision makers that were able to break through the lines of the existing hierarchies and structures that were there, right? And when you look at the advances that have been made on the therapeutic side, and also now the vaccine side, you're looking at names like BioNTech and Moderna, which are biotechs, or in Oxford's case, actually an academic institution. And the collaboration with big pharma like Pfizer and AZ has now taken what was just an innovation now into kind of a commercial, a viable, global distribution, say, of a vaccine. So I think if I chart the course of the year, I think we went from this very, very disorganized, quite hectic scenario where, as we've talked about already, we ourselves in clinical trial settings were taking learnings from Italy, where we sent our drug to start understanding what's the right timing of the intervention, what's the right dose. We were then applying those learnings to a slightly more coordinated trial in the UK, and then applying the learnings from the UK into a global, phase 3 registrational trial. And that sort of suits a biotech because it's a small number of people making quick decisions. But then what happened over the course of the year is it actually needed to be organized, which then starts suiting institutional structures. And for me, what was really interesting was the kind of handoff between the quick, nimble players over to the institutions. And that was kind of the big learning for me. And I think the big success ultimately was those collaborations. So government collaborations with industry and industry collaborations with academia. And I think the healthcare space as a whole has provided a great sort of test bed for that to happen. And speaking from a therapeutic standpoint, we actually haven't made yet the same great advances that the vaccine space has. But the next 6 months is quite critical for us to get all of these therapeutics that are currently undergoing the final stages of trials out there and start actually saving lives as a bridge to the vaccine.
We've got to vaccines, and I'm glad we have, because frankly that's where a lot of the kind of thinking is going to be now. Will you just give us a judgment on the process of development, but also the regulatory approval process, the test and trial process, because we're beginning to see now questions about how effective that is. Those questions were always going to come. And I wonder what you, being kind of directly involved in it, think of the way in which that's been handled.
Yeah, I think what's completely unprecedented about the vaccine space is that, the first 2 vaccines that look like are going to gain approval, so that's Moderna and BioNTech, are both mRNA-based vaccines. And what's amazing from a sort of development perspective is that this is the first time any mRNA vaccine or therapeutic has been approved. The first approval we saw here in the UK. So this is a completely new modality. And the whole benefit of this approach, in theory, was that it's a lot quicker than the traditional, vaccine model, which is what AZ and Oxford are pursuing. So that has now been borne out. I think what was interesting in my experience on sort of drug development and seems to have been echoed on the vaccine side is that what traditionally takes 10 years is being done, in 10 months. And then the question comes to why. And essentially, I think it is 2 key things. One is quicker decision making due to the necessity, and 2 is the kind of the regulators have become more open and more flexible to an innovative approach. And essentially, what we mean by that is we're not having huge gaps and breaks in between, say, a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3 trial. So just breaking those 3 steps down. Traditionally a phase 1 trial is just to show that this intervention, be it a vaccine or a therapeutic, is safe, and usually that's tested in healthy volunteers. A phase 2 trial is what's called the proof of concept. Does this work? And that's usually then tested in actual patients. And the phase 3 trial is then the registrational trial, or the big trial that sort of explains to both regulators and also commercially of how this is all going to then fit in the market. And that also looks for safety signals from a larger population and sort of brings the previous work together. Traditionally, you have breaks in between these trials. The funding packages are separated because the type of risk that you're trying to discharge is different. What we've seen here is essentially rolling regulatory approvals across the trials seamlessly. And actually that rolling regulatory submission and approval has now been seen in the actual final data package. So I think the regulators have really been innovative, and that wasn't something that was immediately obvious to us when we set off on this journey of trying to create therapeutics and trying to create vaccinations. And I think that came as a very pleasant surprise to us in a sort of drug development.
Can I just one question though? What do you think are the chances? Jeremy kicked things off by sort of tipping us towards 2021. What do you think are the chances that we'll see a vaccine withdrawn in the next year?
I think the chances are very low of that happening. The thing about a vaccine as opposed to a therapeutic, and I think this is a very key distinction, is a therapeutic, so a drug that you're giving to someone who tends to be a patient that has some sort of disease. You're giving that to someone who's already suffering in an attempt to try and make them better. A vaccine is a very different modality. You're giving it to the general population, to people who are not otherwise ill, to essentially prevent them from getting a severe form of the disease. So therefore, the threshold or the bar for safety is very, very high. And I think what we have seen is trials that probably actually go over and above a typical vaccine study, because that would happen over a number of years. So here we've had to pack all that into a very short space of time. So we've had such high numbers in the trials that, any small signals that would have then been borne out over time, we would have seen them already. I think on top of that, we have to have a very, very intensive monitoring process that continues. So I think the chances of a vaccine being withdrawn is low. I think what's unprecedented about this is the regulators have really become innovative as to how they approach submission packages and approvals. And that was actually required. And that's shown one of the bottlenecks that traditionally hampers drug development and vaccine development.
And so I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but just before I go to Fiona, the posture, if you like, of this whole inquiry has been, and another thing we want to talk about Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister, and we want to point out what's been going on with test and trace. And by the way, we've got words that we want to say to, centralization in terms of, is there an argument that we're missing the point here when it comes to the healthcare industry? That yes, of course, in a new disease, there have been, catastrophic mistakes and misjudgments. But as an industry, we've never seen an industry move so fast or as effectively as we have. Do you think there's a risk that we're downplaying something positive here?
Yeah, I think when you say healthcare, that's a very, very large industry, right? And I think that there are areas of healthcare, and I think Fiona touched on this, and we'll come on to this later on, where we've actually seen we've seen areas of healthcare that have been either hugely damaged or areas of healthcare that weren't able to adapt as quickly as they necessarily could have. I think in a biotech setting or a sort of pharmaceutical setting, I think Jeremy laid this out very well at the beginning. This is amazing. Like, people who've been in the drug development space for much longer than I have never seen these kind of pressures that we were under and forced to innovate against, and the kind of timelines that we've achieved. So I think, when you say healthcare, it's very broad, but definitely there are areas of healthcare that have been able to adapt and have risen to the challenge. And actually that interestingly, it's quite linked to levels of investment. So, the biotech industry and pharmaceutical industry pumped essentially hundreds of billions of dollars into the development of therapeutics and the development of vaccines, because there are hundreds of billions of dollars to be made by, vaccinating everyone every year. So there's a clear return profile. And I think the same isn't necessarily true in, say, the NHS or other parts of the healthcare industry, which are actually on the front line, forced to face and confront a novel virus in a pandemic situation with the same resources, base of resources that they had, pre-pandemic. And the final thing I'll say is for me, what's been amazing, as a medical doctor who's a CEO of basically an immunology company, is that the immune system holds, as I said, the key for both the prevention and also in an overdrive situation, the deaths. And actually, I think, we can learn a lot just from that simple analogy, because, the immune system has immunological memory. We now need systemic memory in the healthcare setting to make sure that these things don't happen again, similar to how the financial system has a memory of kind of previous financial crashes. The first thing we all did was look at Spanish flu and previous pandemics and try and model this on that, right? So I think that's a key learning on one side. I think on the other side is, it's the immune overdrive that ended up, killing people and that's what was the cause of death. And that's the immune system encountering a novel virus, going into overdrive, and essentially the body shuts down.
Yeah.
And I think we saw a lot of that healthcare going into overdrive too, when we were having massive peaks, and as we've talked about already, that was overwhelming the health system. And the immune system, the way it deals with this is it has an innate and adaptive part. So a fixed part and a variable part. And I think it's that adaptive nature of the healthcare system that we now need to focus on. To Jeremy's point right at the top of this, that's going to help us through 2021 and 2022 and going forward.
It's a massive question, isn't it? Whether or not we have in our systems the same kind of
resilience,
capacity to adapt, exactly as we do in our bodies. So I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I just wanted to pick up, Fiona, what you think of what Dr. Sidhu was saying just there, particularly with regard to the testing and the trial process and public confidence. You may not have seen that as Sumit was talking. J.D. Williamson just pointed out this question about communication of data. And these things all seem to me to intersect: the trial process, the communications process, and now the distribution, and what you read into it.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I wanted to echo the fact that it's remarkable what has been achieved, and we absolutely mustn't underplay that by the biotech companies, the individuals there, the researchers. I also think, in terms of the randomized trials that have been done in the UK with the platform trials like Recovery, where early on the people who had experience of Ebola trying to get therapeutics developed for Ebola got together in Oxford and elsewhere and really said we've got to be in a position to make use of the NHS as this amazing, connected healthcare organisations to really trial drugs at speed and get some results out. And they've done that, and that's been fantastic. The other thing just to mention, as part of the healthcare industry, I would like to argue is the medical publishing industry, and the journals across the world all agreed to make everything free. Anything to do with COVID is free, so at the BMJ and elsewhere at the point of publication. And we also just happened to have set up, by some wonderful chance, the medRxiv, the preprint server at BMJ, in collaboration with Cold Spring Harbor Press and Yale University, which is this first big major medical preprint server. So that's published nearly 9,000 COVID-related preprints, which have been published within a matter of days of submission. So that whole speed at which the communication is happening, I think, has been fantastic. I would argue, though, on the other hand, that there has been, in some areas, too much speed in the sense of data being released by press release results, conclusions, claims being made by press release without the proper underlying data. And that's happened not only with the vaccines to some extent, but also with remdesivir, the Gilead drug that has really began with terrific fanfare. It's been already bought at huge cost by America, and Europe has spent billions, I think 1.2 billion they bought remdesivir. And it's proving to be really not, the real data are showing, as just published by WHO's Solidarity trial, that it's actually not a very good drug, and it has harms that weren't previously mentioned. So, that's an example of too much speed, and in many ways unnecessary, when we had other older drugs, dexamethasone, for example, which proved to be potentially very helpful. So there's obviously terrific commercial push to get the results out. I think we mustn't cut corners on the publication of data. The scrutiny of those data might need to be put through, and caution before we commit to spending vast amounts of money on drugs that just aren't worth it.
I can see Professor Lucy Hoodman is echoing your point there, Fiona. We haven't talked about therapies, and I'd love to hear just a little more of what you think between dexamethasone, remdesivir, but also these blood plasma therapies that we've heard about. What do you think is the state of play on therapeutic treatments for COVID-19?
Well, beginning with dexamethasone, I think that's a real win. It's an old drug, it's cheap, we know how to use it, and it does seem to be very effective in people who are seriously ill with COVID. And the question is how far down that severity spectrum would it be useful? Probably not in mild cases, but so that's a very interesting development, and it may well lead to other developments. I mean, people working in biotech will know better than me what that means in terms of other modalities we should be looking at. The remdesivir one was a failed drug in previous settings, and many echoes, as we've just written in the BMJ about this, with the Tamiflu saga, which was also a failed drug in a previous setting. And, you know, a new setting comes forward and people think, oh, whoopee, we've got this molecule, let's try it out. And so that has been a kind of whole terrific hype, press released, very little data, the White House, you know, President Trump, everything going for it, but no data and not properly, you know, trialed, I think, in the right groups. Now that's happened, and the latest recommendation that we've published with WHO and our colleagues in Norway says that they don't recommend remdesivir in any severity of disease, because there was this question about whether, you know, it was better in different stages in the disease, but the recommendation currently, it doesn't really have a role. So that's pretty devastating for Gilead. I don't know whether it will mean that the European Union will try not to buy the 1.2 billion worth of drug that they've committed to buying. Then you get on.
The UK's not bought it. The UK's not bought it.
UK, I think, I'm afraid I don't know about the UK. Someone else might know on the call about that. It is available. I think we've got emergency use approval for it, but I'm not sure how much of it we've actually bought. Then you get onto convalescent plasma, which you know, is still really being evaluated, but the studies that I've seen suggest it's not very effective. And again, that's something that was hyped a lot, and there's a big push out for people to donate plasma, which is great for research purposes, but I think at the moment it's very much still in evaluation and should only be used in the context of a trial.
Right, thank you. Fiona, I will definitely look into the BMJ's work on remdesivir. That's really interesting, especially Tamiflu, because people sort of understand and know that history and that story well. I said I'd bring Jane Mays in, Fiona, just because she asked this question, which we've all sort of had near experience of or direct experience of, but then you get overtaken by conversations about hospital treatments and ICUs. Jane, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Do you want to? I didn't know whether, and the reason I wanted to bring it, I didn't know whether or not your question came with sort of personal experience of how doctors are thinking about, you know, home visits.
In a way, I've gone through this the pandemic so far as what I call a punter, being on the shielded patients list. And I've been very interested in trying to find out. I know that there was a change in the GP contract prior to the pandemic, or to cope with the pandemic. And I think I understand that's been changed back again. And I know that the BMJ has published some articles which were advising GPs about not going into, or maybe they were assessments of where GPs are with regard to going into care homes in the first place prior to the pandemic, and also what was the advice about going into care homes after the pandemic had started, and about visiting dying people at home, because my understanding has been that you would have only remote care, remote palliative care, and remote end-of-life care. And I'm aware of a couple of published things, one by Laura Finlay, about how to look after your own relative dying at home, which is not very reassuring.
Jane, Fiona, do you want to pick that up? Sorry, Fiona, you're muted right now. I don't know whether that's you or us.
No, I've done it now. Thank you. That sort of the two ends of the spectrum of the very intensive, you know, the sort of drama of the intensive care, and then the rather more less dramatic but incredibly important aspect of palliative care and end-of-life care, and how that became such a, you know, really important piece and possibly neglected until, you know, more recently, that people, I think, have got on top of it. I think the issue about the whole management of the care homes, the shielding, again, it's something that in a better world, in a better, more prepared situation, we would have had protocols for and have thought that through. And I think there were huge mistakes made, as has been acknowledged, in terms of discharging people back into care homes, and you know, the GPs possibly not doing enough, I think, to visit people in care homes as well, because they themselves were worried about the kind of contagion side of it. And many people being told just to stay at home, which I think was very frightening for them without the right support. So, I mean, I think it's again, it's one of those things that history will judge us on, and hopefully 2021, you know, looking forward, we will have learned those lessons, and we'll realise how crucial it is to get that side of things right. I would also just say that this pandemic has sadly brought death much closer for many people than previously, and as a society, our understanding about death and dying, I think, is very rudimentary, really minimal, and not sophisticated or embedded within the way we talk about things. So, you know, without wanting to sound too morbid, I think this is something that will be a benefit, that we have to understand that we all do die, and you know, dying in old age is a privilege, and we have to relinquish life at some point. And there's a whole societal discussion about that, you know, how much to strive at the very ends of life, and how much damage that can do to the individual, and in terms of just resource allocation.
Fiona, thank you. Jane, did you want to come back on that?
Yes, just to ask about the GP contracts. I am aware of the whole discussion, working for the end of life care research group at the Free University of Brussels, obviously. But I'd like to know if Fiona knows specifically about changes in GP contracts and advice about visiting.
I'm really sorry, I don't have the detail on that, but it'd be worth getting someone, maybe there's someone else on the call who does know about that.
Well, Jane, thank you. We will try. We'll try and find out. And if you do know anything or any pointers, you know, do please do suggest. It'd be really helpful. And as you said, if anyone else on the call, please do just sort of wave in my direction in the next few minutes. As we come towards the close of this hour, though, I just wanted to go back to you, Sumit, and just say there's always been the risk in 2020 that we can't see beyond the end of the week, sometimes the end of the day, and that the mistake is in the kind of 90-day planning. And we're looking at an inquiry that's not forward-looking. We're not trying to predict the outcomes for 2021, forgive me. But what we are trying to do is understand whether or not the preparations that are being made now set us up well. And so with an eye to vaccine distribution, what do you read into the government's behaviour and the healthcare industry's behaviour October, November, and into December of 2020?
I think what's sort of, for me anyway, has been quite reassuring is that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. I mean, we do, you know, mass vaccination programs and have been doing so for a long period of time. I think the bit that we're trying to do here is both, you know, create a vaccine for a novel virus and distribute it. And you know, there probably is an element of trying to run, you know, before we can crawl a little bit. But the way I think it was approached by at least the pharma and the biotech industry was that, you know, scientifically, there was always the understanding that we know enough about the science for this to be possible. The timeline was never clear at the beginning, but there was preparations being made well in advance. So I think we saw as early as, you know, April, May, the Oxford vaccine being made in bulk, the BioNTech and Pfizer vaccine being made in bulk. So I think from a pharmaceutical and biotech perspective, you know, the logistics side was there. I think what's been interesting for me to see is from a government perspective. I mean, you're essentially brokering deals with corporations, and I think Oxford and AZ have been quite good about equitable access, and I think that's been driven heavily by Oxford as a sort of university academic institution, and I think now that is starting to filter across into the BioNTech Pfizer side of the story, and we heard a lot from the chief business officer around equitable access, you know, for the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. So I think ultimately, from a, you know, pharmaceutical companies are profit-driven machines, and have invested significant resource into the development of these vaccines and therapeutics. But I think there has been a recognition now that the profit motive is secondary to access to these essentially life-saving interventions. So yeah, it's been interesting seeing the brokering of those deals, and I think we probably don't get the sense, and I think the remdesivir question was raised earlier. We probably don't get a sense of kind of what that actually entails. You just see the headline of 100 million doses and forever increasing numbers of doses being ordered or whatever. But I think the reality is, the cold chains exist. They've been used before, probably not this quickly and to this scale. And we are not reinventing the wheel there. The bit that we're doing more innovatively and differently is the speed at which this is all happening. But when I look at this, I'm not looking at it and poking holes at any of the deals that have been done. I'm seeing significant investment being put in on one side, and now that's being countered by the governments who are both supporting that investment, but also using that great innovation to distribute to where it's needed.
Can I ask you both, which is one question about the intersection between the healthcare industry, if you like, the for-profit sector, and public healthcare, and in particular a question about people. Because one of the things surely we have learned, certainly in my industry in journalism, we've realized we don't have enough doctors, people with scientific backgrounds, or at least scientific, confidence, let's put it that way. And if you look in government too, there have been real questions about the way in which, people with scientific skills intersect with policymakers. And I wondered whether you both, starting with you, Suman, then I'll come to you, Fiona, have come away from this thinking there needs to be a different kind of interplay and a different kind of ability for people to move out of medicine and into public policy or private sector and back and forth. And I know this is a perennial in the healthcare industry and the healthcare profession, but I wonder whether something will change as a result of this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give a couple of examples from myself and my immediate network. So I went from being a junior doctor to working for McKinsey, which is a management consulting firm, to then setting up a series of biotech companies, which is a pretty atypical, non-traditional route. The trial center that led our UK study, which was the Catalyst study supported by the UK government, was University Hospital Birmingham, Europe's largest critical care center, was actually also where I worked as an F1 as a junior doctor. So it was a kind of nice loop for me. But from my medical schools, I was at Oxford. There's a friend of mine who's now working squarely in public health. And one of the interesting points he raised to me right at the start of the pandemic, when we were doing a lot of what Fiona pointed to earlier, and accessing the front line, just because I had a network of frontline doctors that were speaking with me saying, well, hang on, is this a respiratory distress? Is it a typical influenza-like syndrome, or is it different? And we were back-to-backing that with the scientists saying, is this a macrophage infiltrate? Is it a T-cell infiltrate? What kind of drugs are going to work here? And I think Fiona made the very good point that, it was great to see dexamethasone, a drug that we've been tinkering with for 60 years. So we didn't have to tinker with in 60 days, to figure out what to do with it. Whereas, drugs like the one Isana was developing, a monoclonal antibody, needed a lot of variables to come together, for it to work. And luckily, that did take place over time. But one of the interesting things my public health colleague said to me is, he said, I'm getting hedge funds calling me saying, is this going to be, a two-week thing or a 4-week thing? and I was having the same discussion with my investor group, sort of saying, well, it's all going to blow away. And we were all saying, no, epidemiology or, public health epidemiology 101, this isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Immunology 101, there are only a set number of ways through which we can, treat this. The vaccine is the holy grail, and stuff has to happen in between now and then, right? So there was a massive disconnect, and probably the bridge, as you say, James, and I haven't thought about it enough, but clearly you have, is to have more people, like Fiona, like me, and some of these other people, colleagues of mine, coming together in a role that's not just the frontline doctors. Because what we were seeing is intensivists were sort of saying, I know a lot about this, but I don't have enough time to tell you about it on the phone because I've got 16 patients to treat, right? Yes. And that bridge wasn't as strong as it potentially should be in future.
Well, so thank you so much for making the time to join us. Fiona, I'm just going to give you the last word, if I might. What do you think we can do on the people front?
Well, I think there's been a lot of kind of concern, anti-expert, anti-professional feeling in among politicians over the past 15, 20 years, more perhaps. And I think we've had a real lack of people like public health directors. We had a really good tranche of public health directors who were slowly being dismantled and removed. And so the whole loss of leadership and expertise. They tended to be slightly left-wing, slightly radical, very outspoken, very individualistic, and politicians don't necessarily want that. So I think they didn't like that voice, and they've managed to get rid of it over the years. And I think that's a great shame. We needed them, and we need them now more than ever. And I think you're right about the need for more science literacy, if that's the right word, numeracy amongst our leaders, and whether that's to encourage people from medicine, from healthcare, from science, moving into the management place, or whether we've just got to find better ways to communicate these things. It's a very complicated, this is very complicated stuff. Is what's going on in Liverpool mass testing, or is it screening? There's a whole debate about that. Why do we always tend to overstate the benefits of things and not be willing to talk about the harms and the downsides? Where does the commercial and the public sector fit together? These are all challenges that 2021 is going to be facing us with, and we aren't necessarily very well equipped at the moment. So it would be very good to find ways to raise our game.
Well, the one thing I would say, Fiona, is that actually just listening to you and talking about those things, I imagine that a year ago, many of them, the differences between testing and screening, or the extent to which, public policy and personal healthcare intersect, and also our own, political prejudices and the way in which they impact the healthcare. These were subjects that I'm sure were discussed in the pages of the BMJ, discussed no doubt amongst doctors. That the one thing that has changed is that we're all much more alive to them and certainly more interested. And hopefully that is going to make for a more intelligent and, to use Sumit's phrase, adaptive debate. We've come to the end of this hour. We've come actually to the end of the third day of this inquiry. I wanted to say thank you. Thank you to the two of you for helping us through this thicket. Thank you to Jeremy Breyer for setting it all out at the top. A colossal thank you to three colleagues of mine in particular. A whole gang at Tortoise has really worked to make this possible, but Giles Whittell has been the person who helped pull together all of the dossiers. You'll see on each of them there have been different reporters, data researchers pulling together. But I hope you'll look at them and see that it's a thoughtful attempt to try and get at what's happened in 2020. But Giles has been the editor that's made that happen. My colleague Emily Benn has been the person who has been absolutely central to making sure we get the kind of caliber of people we've had in the last hour and in hour after hour over the past 3 days, the last 3 Fridays. But most of all, my colleague Merrippy Mills, who is a fellow editor and partner, and who has that not particularly enviable job of being the person I go to when you say, Merrippy, we need to do something about 2020. What happened? What really happened? We need to try and pull together an inquiry if the government's not. And it's been Merrippy who's been the architect and the orchestrator of it. So a huge thank you to her. And then finally, a thank you to the people who've taken the time to be with us through the course of these days. This is obviously not a tweet. It's not a short and snappy attempt to tell you what's happening in the world. It's a long and deliberate and deliberative process, and it means a great deal to have your interest and curious minds alongside ours. What we will do now is we will gather the transcripts of every single session of these last 3 days, all of the documents that have been shared in the chat, all of the information that has come up in the chat, and we'll spend the next 10 days distilling it. We've distilled the last 2 weeks already and pulled together the findings of the Tortoise COVID inquiry. We hope that it will give a narrative and insight into 2020 and make some sense of it all. So for now, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a very good weekend.